I didn't invite my evil stepmom, who had bullied me for years, to my wedding. In response, my dad threatened to skip the event unless I let her attend, so I invited him as well. I, 25F, am getting married to my high school sweetheart, and we recently sent out the invitations. My fiancé Caleb, 25M, and I decided that I would only invite my parents to the wedding, excluding my stepmother. This decision was easy for me because she's a terrible person, and I feared she would find a way to ruin the day. My stepmother, let's call her Jan, 47F, married my father when I was in the 8th grade. My parents divorced when I was very young, and they never reconciled. They had shared custody, and I spent half the month with my dad and the other half with my mom. It was a great arrangement, allowing me to enjoy the best of both worlds, and I was happy with it. My parents dated other people over the years, but none of those relationships were significant enough for me to be concerned about. This balance continued for a few years until my father started dating Jan when I was in the 6th grade. When he first introduced her to me, she seemed perfectly pleasant, and I actually liked her. However, her behavior quickly changed, and she began to treat me poorly, constantly making me feel like a burden and as if she hated having me around. Look, I get it, some people don't like kids, but that doesn't excuse treating them poorly. At one point, I was practically scared of my stepmother, Jan, and wouldn't approach her at all because I thought she would yell at me. It happened enough times that I began to see it coming, so I stopped trying to talk to her or befriend her. Initially, she would just make faces whenever I entered the room or act really annoyed when I was around, so I tried to be as silent and easily ignored as possible. But after she got engaged to my dad, she started treating me even worse and actively picked on me whenever she could. At first, she did it behind my dad's back, but once they got married, there was no stopping her. She made my childhood a total nightmare, and the worst part was that my father never stood up for me. She saw me as competition, which seems really unhealthy and kind of crazy, but that's how she acted, like I was a contender for her throne or something. She constantly bullied me and made me feel terrible about my appearance, but it didn't stop there. She would even badmouth my mother, saying really nasty things about her. It boiled my blood, and I often talked back to her, but my dad always scolded me for it, and she got away with everything. I tried to talk to my dad several times, but he was so blinded by her that he didn't even realize he was alienating me. He always defended her, claiming that I was the problem. He said that both she and I were important to him, and I would just have to get along with her because he wasn't ready to let go of either of us. He claimed that she only occasionally got annoyed with me because I tried too hard, and she didn't like that. He excused all the bullying by saying that it was just her being concerned about me and that she didn't intend to mock me. But I'm not an idiot. I knew what was going on. He was in denial, trying to convince himself that the woman he married wasn't an absolute monster. I didn't realize it back then, but now I see that my father was always selfish when it came to thinking about me. Back then, it was crucial for me to have a relationship with him, which is why I was willing to tolerate Jan, despite her being a total nightmare. I let her stomp all over me and shatter my self-esteem because I wanted my father to be happy with me. I longed for a normal family where both my parents loved me equally. I stayed with my dad without complaint, hoping things would eventually get better. I never told my mother about Jan's treatment because I feared she would file for full custody, and then I'd never see my father again. Eventually, I stopped complaining to my dad about Jan's behavior because I was paranoid he might give up his rights. I feared ending up in the same place, unable to see him. I was also scared Jan might convince him to give up custody, but that was beyond my control, so I did my best to avoid her and walk on eggshells around her. It's safe to say my childhood was far from easy, and living in my father's house was extremely tough. But somehow, I got through it and maintained a relationship with my father even after I left. Call me a fool, but I was deeply attached to both my parents and couldn't imagine life without them. I was willing to endure anything, so Jan got away with everything. She bullied me throughout high school, and my mental health took a hit. I turned into a silent, introverted kid, something I never was before Jan took over the household. But I tried to keep a brave face, and the thought that in a few years I would be going away to college and she wouldn't be able to ruin my life kept me going. When it was finally time for me to leave for college, I couldn't have been happier. The prospect of moving out of state was exhilarating, and the best part was knowing I would only have to come back for the holidays. I planned to spend major holidays with my mom while keeping a relationship with my father, doing my best not to offend him so he wouldn't cut me off. It was a crazy balancing act, but I managed, and it continued for a few years. Even after graduating and getting a job, I tried to maintain a relationship with my father while enduring Jan, who only seemed to get worse with age. She was often vicious and would try to provoke me, but I refused to let her succeed, which only seemed to make her worse. One day, while visiting my father for lunch, she started picking on me again, and I completely lost it. We had a very nasty fight, probably 3 years ago. After that, my dad only invited me over when Jan wasn't there. I think by then he had finally realized how horribly she treated me and that it would never change. He probably also wanted to maintain a relationship with me because I was his only child. So we started meeting in person either at restaurants or when he was sure Jan wouldn't be at home. It was a bit strange, but it was also a huge relief not to have her constantly around, making everything about herself and her bizarre issues with me. Not to mention, the issues she had with me were completely fabricated and arbitrary. She seemed to dislike me simply because she could, without needing a reason. Part of me even suspects she might have been one of those people who derived satisfaction from treating others, especially kids, badly. If she really saw me as competition, she would have pressured my dad to kick me out or give up custody, but she kept me around just to torment me whenever she wanted. Around the same time, I started dating Caleb. After a few months, I felt it was time for my parents to meet him, so I introduced him at my birthday dinner in my apartment, and everyone seemed to get along. Jan, of course, wasn't invited because we weren't on speaking terms at the time, and after that, we never reconciled. She never knew anything about my relationship with Caleb. We got engaged a couple of months ago and have been planning the wedding ever since. It never occurred to us that Jan might want to be invited because, given how she treated me throughout my childhood and the fallout from our last fight, I didn't think she'd want anything to do with me. Besides, we hadn't spoken in over 3 years and she never made any attempt to mend things, so why would I invite her to the wedding? But when the invitations went out, my father contacted me to say Jan was really upset and offended that she hadn't received one. Caleb and I were keeping the guest list small and private, so it was clear she wasn't welcome. I don't even know why she expected to be invited since she hadn't been to the engagement party, which was all over social media. Granted, I have her blocked, but she might have heard about the wedding from someone. Honestly, I'm sure my dad must have told her, so she knew all along. I didn't believe for a second that she was unaware. She had every opportunity to reach out and apologize, and if she had, I might have considered inviting her to the wedding. But there was no apology, so why should I even consider it? It just doesn't make sense. However, my father insists that I should invite her because she is my stepmom. I think it's a ridiculous idea, and I told him so. But he is adamant, and we've been arguing about it for days. I don't think Jan deserves to be at my wedding because that would mean I consider her family, and I really don't. We've been discussing this for several days, and yesterday, my father told me that if I didn't invite Jan, he wouldn't be attending either. He said it was insulting that his wife wouldn't be invited to such an important family event. I was shocked that he would say something like this, especially since he had never tried to make things right between me and Jan after the fight. I figured Jan was probably just trying to create drama before the wedding. She's an attention seeker, and I'm sure she was enjoying the chaos. But I couldn't understand why my father was indulging her. He could simply tell her that, after terrorizing me my entire childhood, she had no right to expect an invitation to my wedding. Instead of standing up to her, he was once again making it seem like I was the problem and trying to get me to change my mind about the guest list, something he had no say in, by the way. I had started to believe that after our fight, my father was finally seeing things clearly and wouldn't take me for granted again. But after what he said last night, I realized it was never going to change. He was always going to put Jan over me, so I told him it was probably better if he didn't attend the wedding and that I would be rescinding my invitation because I now believe neither he nor Jan deserved to be at such an important event. I told him he was just as bad, if not worse, than January. She was the one who bullied me throughout my childhood and teenage years, but he was the one who allowed it to happen with no consequences because he was too cowardly to stand up to his wife and defend his own daughter. He had never taken a stand for me, and it was foolish of me to expect him to do so now. I told him I'd rather he didn't attend the wedding or even try to contact me in the future because I was done dealing with this. After hanging up, I told Caleb about the conversation with my father, hoping he could reassure me that I had done the right thing. I had no idea what was going to happen next because I'd always assumed that maybe eventually my father would see Jan for what she truly was and stand up for me. Clearly, that was never going to happen, and I had to accept that now. I had expected him to reach out at least once after the fight, but he didn't. However, his family did reach out to tell me I was being extremely ungrateful and needed to apologize to my father. Honestly, I don't see how standing up for myself and being honest about my feelings is ungrateful. I finally stood up for myself after years of deluding myself into thinking my father actually cared about me. Maybe he does, but clearly not enough to tell Jan to back off. His love for me isn't limitless or unconditional, and neither is mine. I think it's unfair to expect me to invite the woman who ruined my childhood to such an important event. I don't trust her, and I would never want her around me after this. It's ridiculous for her to expect an invitation to my wedding. I believe I'm being completely fair by cutting off my father for giving me an ultimatum, but my dad's side of the family thinks I'm being ungrateful. Many of them have texted or called to express their disappointment, saying they expected better. By better, they mean they wanted me to let my dad do whatever he wanted and to stick around regardless of how it made me feel. They believe I should invite Jan to the wedding simply because my dad insists on it. Apparently, I owe it to him because he raised me, provided a good childhood, sent me to college, and is the reason I have a good life now. Honestly, I don't think that's a big deal. Many people do these things for their kids. I've always been grateful for what my dad has done, but I don't think he deserves to be worshipped for it. Like any other parent, he did what was necessary when I was a child. That doesn't mean he can now say and do whatever he wants, and I should just accept it. Let's also not forget that I've made allowances for him. He let Jan bully me my entire life, and I don't know how people are overlooking that crucial part of our relationship. It was no secret that she terrified me as a kid, and my dad never seemed to mind. Everyone in his family knew about it and acted like it wasn't a big deal. It's only a problem if I stand up for myself, I guess. My mother and Caleb think I'm being perfectly fair, and I'm just looking for an unbiased opinion to ensure I'm doing the right thing. So ATA for telling my dad he doesn't need to attend my wedding because he wanted me to invite my stepmom. Update 1. Hi, and thank you so much for the overwhelming response to my post. After reading all the comments, I've decided to stick to my decision to cut off my father. It's shocking how much I was willing to tolerate just to maintain a relationship with him, and even that wasn't enough. I can't believe he doesn't care about his only daughter. It's a terrible feeling, and it just sucks, but it is what it is, and I can't change it. Caleb and my mother have been incredibly supportive, helping me work through my feelings during this tough time. The situation is already difficult enough without my father's side of the family constantly contacting me, reminding me of all the things my father has done for me. Most of what they mention are things that every parent does, but they act like my dad is somehow special for it. I haven't been replying to any messages because it's hard to process, especially since these are people who have watched me grow up and are still against me, just to protect my father's image. I don't know what they hope to achieve by constantly texting me and calling me ungrateful, but I'm not going back on my decision to not invite my father or to try and fix things with him. I've said my piece, and now it's up to him to own up to his mistakes or stay away from me. It's as simple as that. I'm not asking much of him. I'm not demanding he leave his wife because I dislike her, even though I probably should, given how terrible she is. I'm still willing to be the bigger person and let him attend my wedding if he just apologizes for everything he did wrong. That's all I want. But clearly that's too much to ask from someone like my father, who can't even admit he's messed up and only cares about being seen as a good guy. He doesn't actually want to be the good guy, and I get that now. I had convinced myself that my father was a decent human being who cared about me, but that's not true. Any father who truly cared about his daughter would never allow his wife, or anyone else, to treat her the way Jan treated me. But he not only allowed it, he let her get away with it for years. So no, he's certainly not an ideal father, and I'm not being ungrateful. Update 2. Hey, the wedding day is getting closer, and it's been a month since I last spoke to my father. My dad's relatives stopped contacting me or trying to convince me I was wrong after a few days, and I was cut off from that side of the family entirely. I can't say it bothered me, it actually made me feel relieved that everyone showed their true colors before the wedding, ensuring there wouldn't be any drama on the big day. Unfortunately, that didn't completely eliminate the possibility of drama before the wedding. I had almost forgotten about the fight with my father because I've been so busy with wedding planning and work. Things have been hectic, so when my dad showed up at my house the other day, I was completely blindsided. Of course, I let him in because I'm not the kind of person who can just turn people away, especially my father. I don't know if that makes me weak, but I can't turn my parents away, even when we're fighting. I didn't know what to expect, and for a moment, I thought he might apologize when he walked in. But that's not what happened. I guess you could call it an apology in the weakest sense of the word, but he's still not attending my wedding, so it seemed pointless. He came to my house around noon and stayed for about 3 hours. We had an in-depth discussion about our relationship and how to move forward. While we didn't reach a decision, the talk was much needed. He finally acknowledged that Jan had been a bully and that he had let many things slide when I was a kid simply because he didn't want to pick a fight with her. It was actually quite refreshing to hear him admit that, as I never really expected him to own up to the truth. Up until now, his only strategy had been to gaslight me into believing I was somehow responsible for the way she treated me as a kid. I would believe it because my dad said it, but as I grew older, I knew that wasn't the case. I never spoke up against it because I was so desperate to maintain a relationship with him and didn't want to be cut off. But now it was all out in the open, thanks to his admission. I thought he was going to apologize for everything he had done, but he didn't. Instead, he said that while he felt bad about it, he couldn't bring himself to say sorry because, he claimed, it was the only way he could have a normal life without constantly worrying about either Jan or me. I don't think that's true because he could have intervened and tried to mend things between us, but he deliberately stayed out of it because he didn't want to stand up to January gaslighting me into believing I was the problem was easier than confronting his wife, as kids are much easier to manipulate, and everyone knows that. He also knew I would never do anything to jeopardize my relationship with him, and he shamelessly used that against me to keep me compliant and out of his way. So Jan continued to bully me, and my dad just stayed out of her way, letting me face her wrath. He told me he loved both of us and didn't want to ruin either relationship, so he chose to shirk his responsibilities, and he succeeded. While he didn't apologize to me or say the words, "I'm sorry," I can't consider it a genuine apology. He'd expressed interest in being part of my life going forward and suggested we start therapy together or at least take steps to remedy the situation. He also told me that he still couldn't attend my wedding if I didn't invite Jan because she had been really offended by not being included. She expected me to let go of the past, despite her actions being unforgivable, and my dad had already agreed that he wouldn't be attending if she wasn't invited. As a matter of fact, Jan didn't even know about my dad's recent visit to my place because she was against the idea of us having any relationship. Apparently, she had allowed it when I was a kid because she thought it was important for my father to feel like a dad and have me around. But now, as a full-grown woman, I'm capable of handling myself, so I don't need to run to daddy every time I'm in trouble. That's some great logic for separating a father from his daughter. I can't believe he's still falling for it and letting her get away with these things, but I don't really know what to expect from my father anymore. We had a really long discussion the other day, but it ended up going nowhere. I'm starting to think there's no point in trying to mend things with my dad because Jan will always be his top priority, and I just can't deal with that anymore. I don't even know what to say about him. This whole situation is incredibly upsetting. Update 3. Hi, it's been a while since my last update, and I'm happy to share that Caleb and I are now married. We had the wedding of our dreams with the people we wanted around us just a few days ago. It was beautiful and perfect. Unfortunately, my dad wasn't there. Like many of you, I had hoped that he might come to his senses and choose to leave Jan so he could attend, but that didn't happen, and we're still not on speaking terms. I know in my last update I mentioned that my dad and I had talked about working on our relationship and starting therapy, but none of that ever happened. After our discussion, we tried to stay in touch, but he stopped responding after a few days. I kept reaching out, but he never replied. Work got busy as I was wrapping up everything before my wedding, and I ended up forgetting to text him or check up on him. He could have reached out to me, but he didn't, and we stopped speaking after that. I heard from some relatives who are still in touch with me that he and Jan moved to the suburbs recently, which is probably what kept him busy. I can't understand why he didn't tell me or why he even visited me that one last time, making promises he had no intention of keeping. I'm doing just fine, but I was a bit put off and disappointed that even after making those promises, he didn't actually show up for me and make it count. It's fine though, he's disappointed me enough times that I'm used to it now, and I'm not going to let it happen again. I'm going to focus on the relationships I have with the people who truly care about me, like my husband and my mom. Caleb and I are heading off on our honeymoon in a couple of days, and that's the only thing on my mind now. Can't wait, lol.